There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Not the exhaustion that comes from working too hard. Not the tiredness that follows a long day. I'm talking about the quiet exhaustion that comes from spending your entire life trying to be enough for everyone. Enough for your family. Enough for your work. Enough for the people you love. Enough for the invisible standards living inside your own head. And the frightening part is that most people don't even realize they're doing it. They move through life carrying an invisible pressure that whispers the same thing over and over again. Do more. Be better. Don't disappoint anyone. Don't fall behind. Until eventually, their entire existence becomes performance designed to earn worthiness. And somewhere along the way, they forget how to simply exist without constantly proving themselves. Tonight, we're going to talk about that exhaustion, not as a weakness, not as a failure, but as a natural result of carrying expectations no human nervous system was ever meant to carry forever. And more importantly, we're going to explore what happens when you finally stop trying to earn the right to feel worthy of your own life. The invisible pressure to be enough. There is a pressure most people carry that they never talk about directly, not because it is small, but because it has become so normal that they no longer recognize it as pressure at all. It follows them everywhere, into their work, into their relationships, into the way they speak, into the way they look at themselves in the mirror. It whispers constantly, you should be further ahead by now. You should be doing more. You should be more successful, more attractive, more disciplined, more impressive. And no matter how much they accomplish, the feeling never fully leaves. That's the trap, because this pressure was never designed to be satisfied. It was designed to keep you chasing. That's the key. Modern society profits from your dissatisfaction. Think about it carefully. Everywhere you look, there's another message telling you that who you are right now is not enough. Social media tells you your life should look better. Your body should look better. Your income should be higher. Your mornings should be more productive. Your relationship should be more exciting. Your mindset should be stronger. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin living inside a constant comparison. Not because you are weak, because comparison has become the culture itself. You open your phone for 5 minutes, and immediately your nervous system starts measuring your life against hundreds of carefully edited performances. That person looks happier. That person looks richer. That person looks more confident. That person seems ahead. And the dangerous part is this. Your brain compares your behind-the-scenes reality to someone else's highlight reel every single day. That is psychological poison. And most people never question it. They simply absorb it. Then they wonder why peace feels impossible. You have a choice. You can continue building your identity around comparison, or you can step outside the game completely. Because the truth is simple. There will always be someone richer than you, more attractive than you, more successful than you, more talented than you. If your worth depends on being better than everyone else, your peace will never survive. Never. That's why so many people secretly feel exhausted all the time. Not physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, because they are living every day as though life is one endless audition, trying to prove themselves, trying to justify their existence, trying to earn the right to feel valuable. And most of that conditioning began long before social media ever existed. It began in childhood. That's where this story usually starts. You learn very early that achievement created approval. Good grades earned praise. Good behavior earned attention. Success earned love. Failure earned disappointment. So your nervous system adapted. It made a dangerous connection. If I achieve, I am worthy. If I disappoint people, I lose love. That conditioning follows people deep into adulthood. They become adults who cannot rest without guilt. Adults who panic when someone is upset with them. Adults who over-explain themselves constantly. Adults who feel anxious saying no. Adults who attach their entire self-worth to performance. Because somewhere deep inside them, there is still a frightened child asking the same question. Am I enough now? Listen carefully. You did not choose that conditioning consciously, but you are responsible for healing it. That's the key. Because if you do not challenge that pattern, it will quietly control your entire life. You will become addicted to approval. And approval addiction is one of the most dangerous addictions in the modern world. Because unlike alcohol or drugs, society rewards it. People praise you for overworking yourself. They praise you for sacrificing your peace. They praise you for never slowing down. They praise you for always being available. But eventually the cost appears. You lose yourself. That's what happens to people pleasers. They become experts at reading everyone else's emotional needs while becoming completely disconnected from their own. They know exactly how to avoid disappointing others, but they have no idea what actually makes them happy. And here's the painful truth. The more your identity depends on external validation, the more emotionally fragile your life becomes. One criticism destroys you. One rejection ruins your week. One unanswered message sends your mind spiraling. Because your self-worth was never internal. It was outsourced. That's why approval addiction creates anxiety. You become emotionally dependent on reactions you cannot control. Think about how exhausting that is. Trying to manage everyone's perception of you. Trying to avoid judgment. Trying to keep everyone satisfied. Try and make sure nobody leaves. Nobody gets upset. Nobody misunderstands you. It is impossible. And yet millions of people spend their entire lives attempting it anyway. That is why they are tired. Not because life is impossible. Because they are carrying psychological weight they were never meant to carry. You cannot build peace on top of constant performance. You cannot heal while continuously trying to become acceptable to everyone. You cannot hear your authentic self while your mind is obsessed with managing how other people see you. That's the truth most people avoid. And social media makes this even worse. Because now, people are not only performing for their families or co-workers, they are performing for the entire world. Every photo becomes branding. Every opinion becomes image management. Every moment becomes content. People no longer ask, what feels meaningful? They ask, what looks impressive? That shift changes everything. Because eventually you stop living your life. You start curating it. And there is a massive psychological difference between those two things. One creates presence. The other creates anxiety. You have a choice. You can keep performing. Or you can start returning to yourself. But understand this clearly. Returning to yourself will feel uncomfortable at first. Because when your nervous system has been trained to seek approval for years, authenticity feels dangerous. Saying no feels dangerous. Slowing down feels dangerous. Disappointing people feels dangerous. Why? Because your brain still believes rejection threatens survival. That's why people stay trapped. Not because they are weak. Because their nervous systems became addicted to validation. But addiction is not destiny. Patterns can change. That's the key. The first step is awareness. You must begin noticing how often your decisions are actually driven by fear of disapproval. Watch yourself carefully. Notice how often you apologize unnecessarily. Notice how often you seek reassurance. Notice how often you explain yourself to people who never asked for an explanation. Notice how often you abandon your own needs to avoid discomfort. That awareness matters, because you cannot change a pattern you refuse to see. And once you start seeing it, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Most people are not actually living freely. They are managing perceptions. That is not freedom. Freedom is being able to disappoint people without collapsing emotionally. Freedom is being able to rest without guilt. Freedom is being able to exist without constantly proving your worth. You don't need everyone's approval. You never did. You do not need to earn the right to exist peacefully. You do not need to perform your humanity perfectly in order to deserve love. You do not need their permission to value yourself. That's the key. And the moment you stop treating your life like a performance, something extraordinary begins to happen. Your nervous system starts relaxing. Your mind becomes quieter. Your decisions become clearer. Because for the first time in years, You are no longer spending all your energy trying to become enough for everyone else. You begin becoming real instead, and that changes everything. But understanding the pressure is only the beginning, because even after people recognize these patterns, many still feel trapped inside a mind that never fully rests. A mind constantly preparing, constantly worrying, constantly scanning for danger. You master the awareness of the pressure. Now, let's talk about the machine creating it. Why your mind never lets you rest. Most people think they are tired because they have too much to do. That's not the real problem. The real problem is that their minds never stop running, even when they sit down, even when the workday ends, even when the room is quiet. Their body is still, but their nervous system is not. That's why so many people feel exhausted after doing nothing, because mentally, they were fighting invisible battles all day long, replaying conversations, predicting worst-case scenarios, preparing for rejection, imagining failure, scanning constantly for danger. And after years of doing this, the mind forgets how to relax. That's the key. Your mind became a security guard that never clocks out, always watching, always monitoring, always anticipating threats that may never come. At first, this pattern was probably useful. Maybe you grew up in an environment where being alert protected you. You learned to read people's moods carefully. You learned to detect emotional shifts instantly. You learned to prepare for criticism before it arrived. You learned to overthink because unpredictability felt dangerous. Your nervous system adapted for survival. That adaptation helped you once, but now it is exhausting you because survival mode was never meant to become a permanent identity. And yet for millions of people, it has. They wake up anxious, work anxious, rest anxious, sleep anxious, not because danger is everywhere, because their nervous systems no longer know the difference between discomfort and danger. That changes everything. Listen carefully. Your brain does not care about happiness first. It cares about survival first. That's why fear is so powerful. That's why rejection feels so painful. That's why failure feels catastrophic. To your nervous system, rejection once meant isolation. Isolation once meant danger. So your brain learned to avoid rejection at all costs. That is why people overexplain themselves. Why they say yes when they mean no. Why they obsess over people's opinions. Why they panic over criticism. Why they cannot relax after making mistakes. Because deep down, their nervous systems still believe, if people reject me, I am unsafe. But most of the threats your mind reacts to today are not life-threatening. They are emotional discomfort. That's the difference. And if you never learn that difference, your nervous system will keep treating ordinary life like an emergency. That's why your mind never rests. Overthinking is not intelligence. Most of the time, it is fear disguised as preparation. Read that again. Overthinking is fear pretending to be productivity. You tell yourself you are figuring things out, but what are you actually doing? Replaying, catastrophizing, imagining, rehearsing pain before it happens. And none of it creates peace. That's the trap. Because overthinking creates the illusion of control. Your brain says, if I analyze this enough, maybe I can prevent pain. If I prepare enough, maybe I can avoid failure. If I worry enough, maybe nothing bad will happen. But life does not work that way. You cannot think your way into complete safety. You cannot control every outcome. You cannot eliminate uncertainty. And the harder you try, the more exhausted your mind becomes. You have a choice. You can continue feeding the cycle, or you can begin training your nervous system to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing emotionally. That's the real work. Most people are not addicted to thinking. They are addicted to certainty. But certainty is impossible. That's the key. Life will always contain uncertainty. Relationships are uncertain. Money is uncertain. Health is uncertain. The future is uncertain. Trying to remove all uncertainty from life is like trying to stop the ocean from moving. Impossible. And yet people spend years attempting exactly that. That's why relaxing feels unsafe to so many people. Because when the mind stops moving, unresolved fear becomes visible. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. Rest becomes uncomfortable. Why? Because distraction was protecting them from themselves. Think about how quickly people reach for stimulation. The phone, the notifications, the noise, the scrolling, the endless content. Why? Because stillness forces confrontation. And many people are terrified of what they might feel if everything became quiet for 5 minutes. That's the truth. A nervous system addicted to survival mode experiences peace as unfamiliar, and unfamiliar often feels dangerous. That's why some people sabotage calm relationships, sabotage peaceful opportunities, sabotage rest itself. Chaos feels normal. Stress feels normal. Urgency feels normal, because their bodies became chemically attached to high-alert living. But normal does not mean healthy. That's the key. You do not heal by continuing to feed the state that is destroying you. You heal by interrupting it. That begins with awareness. You must start catching yourself in the act. Notice when your mind begins spiraling. Notice when your body becomes tense. Notice how quickly your brain jumps toward catastrophe. Notice how often you assume the worst before reality even confirms anything. That awareness matters, because unconscious patterns control people. Conscious patterns can be changed. Now listen carefully to this next part. Your thoughts are not commands. They are not prophecies. They are not always reality. They are mental events. That changes everything. Most people automatically believe every fearful thought their minds generate. And that is why anxiety controls them. The thought appears. What if I fail? And immediately the nervous system reacts as though failure already happened. The thought appears. What if they reject me? And suddenly the body floods with fear. But thoughts are not facts. That's the key. A fearful mind produces fearful predictions. That does not make those predictions true. You have to stop worshiping every anxious thought your brain creates. You have to create distance. Observe the thought. Do not immediately obey it. That is discipline. It's not about eliminating fear. It's about refusing to let fear run your life. There's a massive difference. Strong people still feel fear. Calm people still feel anxiety. The difference is that they no longer surrender authority to every emotional reaction. That's the transformation. And here is where real healing begins. Not with controlling every external situation, but with teaching your nervous system that you can survive discomfort without panicking. You survive awkward conversations. You survive mistakes. You survive rejection. You survive uncertainty. You survive being misunderstood. And every time you stop treating discomfort like danger, your nervous system slowly begins relaxing. That's how peace is built, not through perfection, through repetition. You repeatedly teach yourself, I can handle this. I do not need to panic. I do not need to catastrophize. I do not need to solve my entire future tonight. That repetition rewires people. That's the key. Now let's get practical. If you want your mind to rest again, you must stop feeding the machine that keeps it afraid. Stop consuming endless stimulation before sleep. Stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. Stop replaying conversations for hours. Stop treating every mistake like evidence of your inadequacy. Stop explaining yourself to everyone. Stop rehearsing imaginary disasters. Every time you interrupt those patterns, you weaken them. And every time you feed them, you strengthen them. You have a choice. Train your nervous system toward peace, or train it toward permanent survival mode. Most people never realize they are training themselves every single day, but they are. Your habits become emotional conditioning. That's why discipline matters. It's not about punishment. It's about nervous system training. That's the key. A calm mind is not created accidentally. It is built deliberately, moment by moment, thought by thought, choice by choice. And eventually something incredible starts happening. The mind slows down. The body softens. The fear loses authority. You stop reacting to every emotional wave. You stop living as though catastrophe is always around the corner. You stop needing constant reassurance. For the first time in years, your inner world begins feeling safe again. Not because life became predictable, but because you became stronger than the panic itself. And that changes everything. But fear is only one side of the trap. Because underneath the overthinking, underneath the anxiety, underneath the constant survival mode, there is another force controlling people's lives. The desperate need to avoid failure at all costs. You are learning how your mind became trapped. Now let's talk about the fear that keeps most people small. The addiction to validation. Human beings want to feel accepted. That is normal. That is healthy. But somewhere along the way, many people cross a dangerous line. They stopped appreciating approval and started needing it to survive emotionally. That changes everything. Because the moment your worth depends on applause, silence becomes terrifying. Read that again. The moment your worth depends on applause, silence becomes terrifying. No compliment feels like rejection. No response feels personal. No validation feels like failure. And suddenly your emotional state is no longer controlled by your values. It is controlled by reactions, other people's reactions. That is one of the most dangerous ways to live, because reactions are unstable. People are inconsistent. Opinions change constantly. And if your self-worth rises and falls based on external approval, your peace becomes fragile. That's the trap. Most people do not realize how addicted they are to validation until they stop receiving it. Then anxiety appears. Then the panic appears. Then the overthinking begins. What did I do wrong? Why are they distant? Why didn't they respond? Why didn't they notice me? Why didn't they appreciate me? Notice something carefully. The mind immediately assumes the absence of validation means the absence of worth. That is emotional conditioning. And most people learn it early, very early. As children, they were praised for achievement, praised for obedience, praised for performance, praised for being easy to manage. So the brain learns something dangerous. If people approve of me, I am safe. If people praise me, I matter. If people are disappointed in me, I lose value. That conditioning does not disappear automatically in adulthood. It evolves. Children seeking approval become adults addicted to external validation. That's why some people cannot post something online without obsessively checking reactions. Why some people cannot make decisions without asking everyone else first. Why some people stay trapped in relationships that destroy them. Why some people spend their entire lives performing versions of themselves that are acceptable instead of authentic. Because approval became emotional survival. And survival feels serious. That's the key. Listen carefully. Approval addiction is exhausting because it forces you to abandon yourself constantly. You begin editing your personality, filtering your opinions, suppressing your needs, managing your image. Try and become emotionally acceptable to everyone around you. But here's the problem. The more you shape yourself around external approval, the less connected you become to your real identity. You stop asking, what do I actually want? And start asking, what will make people approve of me? That question destroys people quietly, because eventually they wake up one day and realize they built an entire life around avoiding rejection instead of pursuing truth. That realization hurts, but it also creates freedom, because once you see the pattern clearly, you can stop feeding it. You have a choice. Continue chasing approval, or begin building self-respect. There is a difference. Approval depends on other people. Self-respect depends on your own standards. Approval is unstable. Self-respect is internal. Approval asks, how do they see me? Self-respect asks, can I respect myself when nobody is watching? That's the key. Most people are starving for praise because they never learn how to validate themselves internally. So they become emotionally dependent on external reactions. Compliments become emotional fuel. Attention becomes emotional fuel. Likes become emotional fuel. Recognition becomes emotional fuel. And when those things disappear, they crash emotionally. That is dependency, not confidence. Real confidence is quieter than that. Real confidence does not need constant confirmation. Real confidence is the ability to remain grounded even when nobody applauds you, even when nobody notices, even when nobody understands your path. That is strength. But most people fear disappointing others more than they fear abandoning themselves. Think about that carefully. They will sacrifice peace to avoid criticism, sacrifice honesty to avoid conflict, sacrifice authenticity to avoid rejection, and over time, they become emotionally fragmented. One version of themselves for work, another for family, another online, another in relationships, always adjusting, always adapting, always performing, never resting. Because the nervous system believes, if I stop performing correctly, people will leave. That fear controls millions of lives. And social media multiplied the problem dramatically, because now validation is measurable. Likes, views, followers, comments. People are literally quantifying approval now. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin attaching emotional worth to numbers on a screen. That is psychologically dangerous, because algorithms are not designed to protect your mental health. They are designed to capture your attention. That's the key. And the more emotionally dependent you become on external validation, the easier you are to manipulate. One compliment changes your mood. One criticism ruins your day. One rejection destroys your confidence. That is not emotional freedom. That is emotional captivity. Strong people do not give strangers that much control over their nervous systems. You shouldn't either. Now listen carefully to this next part. Seeking approval is not the same as connection. Many people confuse those two things. Connection is honest. Approval seeking is performative. Connection allows disagreement. Approval addiction fears disagreement. Connection creates peace. Approval addiction creates anxiety. That's the difference. And if you want peace, you must become willing to disappoint people sometimes. There is no other way. You cannot live honestly while trying to keep everyone comfortable. Impossible. Some people will misunderstand you. Some people will judge you. Some people will dislike your boundaries. Some people will leave when you stop overgiving. Let them. That's the key. You do not need their permission to become emotionally free. You do not need universal approval to live a meaningful life. You do not need everyone to understand your decisions. And the moment you stop needing constant validation, something incredible begins happening. Your mind becomes quieter. Your decisions become clearer. Your relationships become more honest, because you stop manipulating yourself to secure approval. That changes everything. Now, let's talk about transformation. How do you break approval addiction? First, stop over-explaining yourself. Most over-explaining comes from fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of rejection. Fear of disappointing people. But confident people understand something deeply. Not everyone needs access to your reasoning. You do not owe everyone emotional presentations about your decisions. No is a complete sentence. That's discipline. Second, practice disappointing people intentionally in small ways. Not cruelly, not arrogantly, but honestly. Say no sometimes. Set boundaries. Stop rescuing everyone emotionally. Stop saying yes when your body is screaming no. Your nervous system needs proof that rejection is survivable. That is how freedom develops. Third, stop seeking reassurance constantly. Every time you ask, "Are you mad at me? Was that okay? Do you still like me?" you reinforce dependency. Learn to tolerate uncertainty without panicking. That's maturity. Fourth, spend time alone without distraction. This matters, because people addicted to validation often fear silence. Why? Because silence removes external feedback. No applause, no reassurance, no stimulation, just you. And many people have spent years avoiding themselves. But self-respect grows in solitude. That's the key. You must learn to enjoy your own company without needing constant external confirmation of your worth. That changes people deeply. Finally, begin asking yourself a new question. Not, do they approve of me? Ask, am I proud of how I showed up? That question creates internal stability, because now your worth depends on your integrity, not on unpredictable reactions. That is emotional freedom. And once people stop controlling your self-worth, fear loses power over you. Criticism loses power. Rejection loses power. Silence loses power. Because your identity is no longer living in other people's hands. It is finally living inside your own, and that is where peace begins. But even after escaping approval addiction, many people still carry another hidden wound. A deep loneliness created by years of abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable. You are learning how to stop performing. Now let's talk about the emotional cost of losing yourself completely. The quiet loneliness of people pleasers. There is a particular kind of loneliness that many people carry silently. A loneliness that exists even when they are surrounded by people. Even when they are loved. Even when they are constantly needed. Because being needed and being known are not the same thing. That's the key. And people pleasers often discover this too late. They spend years becoming whatever everyone else needs. Reliable, available, helpful, easy, understanding, supportive. And eventually they wake up emotionally exhausted, wondering why they still feel invisible. The answer is painful. You became so good at being what everyone needed that nobody noticed who you actually were. Read that again. That sentence explains the emotional burnout of millions of people. Because people-pleasing is not kindness. Not always. Sometimes it is fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of conflict. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of not being loved if you stop giving constantly. That changes everything. Most people pleasers learned early that keeping other people happy created safety, so they adapted. They became emotionally hyper-aware. They learned to read moods instantly, learned to avoid tension, learned to anticipate needs before anyone spoke them aloud. And everyone praised them for it. You're so thoughtful. You're so mature. You're so selfless. But underneath that behavior was often a terrified nervous system asking one question. If I stop being useful, will people still love me? That is not peace. That is survival mode disguised as kindness. And survival mode is exhausting. Because people pleasers rarely rest emotionally. They are always managing. Managing people's emotions. Managing expectations. Managing reactions. Trying to make sure everyone feels okay. Trying to prevent disappointment before it happens. Trying to avoid becoming the reason someone feels uncomfortable. But here's the truth they avoid. You cannot build a peaceful life while making yourself emotionally responsible for everyone else. Impossible. That's why so many people pleasers secretly feel resentful. Not because they are bad people, because they abandoned themselves for too long. Every time you say yes when you mean no, your body notices. Every time you suppress your truth to keep someone comfortable, your nervous system notices. Every time you tolerate disrespect to avoid conflict, your self-respect weakens a little more. That accumulation matters. People think burnout only comes from working too much. No, emotional burnout often comes from self-abandonment. That's the key. And self-abandonment becomes addictive. At first, it feels easier to prioritize everyone else. Easier to avoid conflict. Easier to stay agreeable. Easier to keep peace externally. But eventually internal chaos grows. You feel emotionally drained constantly. You feel unseen, unappreciated, disconnected. Not because nobody cares about you. Because nobody ever met the real you. They met the version designed to keep them comfortable. That realization hurts deeply. Because people pleasers often build relationships on emotional performance instead of honesty. They become experts at support, but beginners at vulnerability. They know how to give, but not how to receive. Know how to help, but not how to ask for help. Know how to stay emotionally available for everyone else, but feel guilty the moment they need something themselves. That imbalance destroys people slowly. And the worst part? Most people around them never notice. Why? Because people pleasers hide their exhaustion well. They smile while overwhelmed. Say, "I'm fine," while collapsing internally. Continue helping while emotionally empty. And eventually they begin feeling emotionally alone even inside relationships. That is the quiet loneliness of self-abandonment. Listen carefully. If people only love the version of you that never says no, never has needs, never creates discomfort, they do not fully know you. That's the truth. Real connection requires honesty, not performance. Real intimacy requires boundaries, not endless sacrifice. Real love can survive disappointment. That's the key. But people pleasers fear disappointing others more than they fear destroying themselves. So they stay silent, stay agreeable, stay exhausted, stay overextended, and then wonder why life feels heavy all the time. Your body was never designed to carry everyone emotionally forever. You are not responsible for regulating every room you walk into. You are not responsible for preventing everyone's discomfort. You are not responsible for fixing everyone's pain. That responsibility is crushing you, and somewhere deep inside, you already know it. You have a choice. Continue abandoning yourself, or begin telling the truth, not aggressively, not cruelly, honestly. That is where healing begins. Now understand something important. Setting boundaries will feel uncomfortable at first. Why? Because people-pleasing trained your nervous system to associate boundaries with danger. When you finally say no, guilt appears. When you stop overgiving, anxiety appears. When you stop rescuing everyone emotionally, fear appears. That reaction is normal. Your nervous system is adjusting. That's the key. Discomfort does not mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes discomfort means you are finally breaking a destructive pattern. Strong boundaries often feel terrifying to people who are trained to earn love through self-sacrifice. But boundaries are not selfish. They are clarity. They teach people how to treat you. They protect your energy. They protect your peace. And without them, resentment grows automatically. That's why many people pleasers secretly explode eventually. Years of suppressed needs become anger. Years of emotional exhaustion become bitterness. Years of silence become emotional numbness. Not because they are cruel people. Because no human being can continuously abandon themselves forever without consequences. That's reality. Now let's get practical. How do you stop people pleasing? First, start noticing automatic yes. This matters. Many people say yes before they even check how they actually feel. Pause. Breathe. Ask yourself, do I genuinely want to do this? Or, am I afraid of disappointing them? That awareness changes everything. Second, stop apologizing for having needs. You do not need to apologize for resting. You do not need to apologize for boundaries. You do not need to apologize for protecting your mental health. That's discipline. Third, allow people to experience their own emotions without immediately fixing them. This is difficult for people pleasers. Someone becomes upset, and immediately you panic internally. You rush to solve, explain, comfort, repair. Why? Because their discomfort triggers your nervous system. But mature emotional health means understanding this. Other people are allowed to feel disappointed sometimes. You are allowed to survive that disappointment without collapsing. That's growth. Fourth, spend time discovering who you are outside of usefulness. This is huge. Many people pleasers do not actually know themselves deeply. They know roles, responsibilities, expectations, but not themselves. Ask yourself difficult questions. What do you actually enjoy? What drains you? What matters to you when nobody is watching? What kind of life feels peaceful to you personally? Not impressive, not approved, peaceful. Those answers matter, because healing requires reconnecting with the self you abandoned. Finally, stop measuring your worth by how much you sacrifice. That conditioning destroys people. You do not earn value through exhaustion. You do not become more lovable by neglecting yourself. You do not become more worthy by carrying everyone else emotionally. That is not strength. That is survival conditioning. Real strength is different. Real strength is honesty, boundaries, self-respect, authenticity, the courage to disappoint people when necessary, the courage to stop performing, the courage to finally exist as a real human being instead of an emotional service provider for everyone around you. That transformation changes everything, because the moment you stop abandoning yourself, your nervous system finally begins feeling safe enough to rest. You stop overfunctioning constantly. You stop chasing approval constantly. You stop trying to earn love through exhaustion. And for the first time in years, you begin feeling emotionally present inside your own life again. Not because everyone approves of you, but because you finally stop disappearing. That is freedom. But even after people escape people-pleasing, another trap still controls them deeply. The impossible pressure to become flawless, to avoid mistakes, to never fail, to appear perfect. You are learning how to stop abandoning yourself. Now let's talk about the hidden fear underneath perfectionism itself. Why perfectionism is secretly fear. Most people think perfectionism is a sign of high standards, discipline, ambition, excellence. But most perfectionism is not confidence. It is fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of being exposed as inadequate. That's the truth people avoid. Perfectionism is anxiety wearing expensive clothes. Read that again. Perfectionism is anxiety wearing expensive clothes. Because underneath the polished image, underneath the endless overpreparation, underneath the obsession with getting everything exactly right, there is usually one terrified question. What if I'm not enough if I fail? That question controls millions of lives. People delay starting because they fear doing it imperfectly. They overwork because mistakes feel emotionally dangerous. They obsess over tiny details because criticism feels unbearable. They tie their entire identity to success because failure feels like a personal collapse. That is not healthy ambition. That is emotional survival. And survival mode destroys peace. That's the key. Perfectionists often look strong from the outside, organized, driven, responsible, successful, but internally, many of them are exhausted, constantly tense, constantly overthinking, constantly afraid of making the wrong move. Because when your self-worth depends on performance, every mistake feels threatening, every failure feels humiliating, every imperfection feels personal. That creates enormous anxiety. Think about how perfectionists approach life. Nothing is ever fully enough. Finish one goal. Immediately pressure yourself toward the next. Achieve something meaningful. Immediately minimize it. Reach success. Still feel behind. Because perfectionism does not create satisfaction. It creates chronic emotional insufficiency. That's the trap. The perfectionist's mind constantly moves a finish line. And eventually people realize something painful. They are not chasing excellence anymore. They are chasing emotional safety. That changes everything. Listen carefully. There is nothing wrong with wanting to improve yourself. Nothing wrong with discipline. Nothing wrong with caring deeply about your work. But there is a massive difference between healthy growth and fear-driven perfectionism. Healthy growth says, I want to improve. Perfectionism says, I must avoid failure at all costs. Healthy growth allows mistakes. Perfectionism treats mistakes like identity threats. Healthy growth creates energy. Perfectionism creates exhaustion. That's the difference. And most perfectionists learn this pattern early in life. They were praised for achievement, praised for success, praised for being exceptional. So their nervous systems learn something dangerous. My value increases when I perform perfectly. That conditioning becomes addictive, because achievement temporarily relieves insecurity. Temporarily, but never permanently. That's why perfectionists often become high achievers who secretly hate themselves. Externally successful, internally anxious, always chasing another accomplishment to finally feel enough. But enough never arrives. Because perfectionism is not solving insecurity. It is feeding it. That's the key. And social media intensified this dramatically. Now people compare themselves to impossible standards constantly. Perfect bodies, perfect productivity, perfect careers, perfect lifestyles, perfect relationships. Everyone performing perfection publicly. Nobody showing the anxiety underneath it. So people begin believing they're falling behind in a race that does not even exist. That destroys mental peace. And the dangerous part is this. Perfectionism often disguises itself as responsibility. People say, I just care a lot. I just want to do things properly. I just have high standards. Maybe, but sometimes the deeper truth is this. You are terrified of judgment, that honesty matters. Because transformation cannot happen without truth. You have a choice. Continue building your life around fear of failure, or begin building it around courage. There is a difference. Fear asks, what if I fail? Courage asks, what if I survive failure and grow stronger? That mindset changes everything, because failure is unavoidable. No human being escapes mistakes. No human being escapes embarrassment. No human being escapes imperfection. Try and become flawless is like try to become non-human, impossible, and exhausting. That's why perfectionists often procrastinate. People misunderstand this completely. They think procrastination means laziness. No, many perfectionists procrastinate because they are overwhelmed by impossible expectations. If the result cannot be perfect, the nervous system panics. So they delay, avoid, overthink, wait for the perfect moment. But perfection never arrives. That's the trap. Perfectionism often kills action. And action is the thing people actually need. Listen carefully to this sentence. It's not about perfection. It's about consistency. That's the key. A person doing imperfect work consistently will outperform a perfectionist frozen by fear almost every time. Because life rewards movement, not obsession. The perfectionist wants guarantees before acting, but life does not offer guarantees. Ever. You must learn to move despite uncertainty, despite imperfection, despite fear. That is maturity. And here is another painful truth. Perfectionists often struggle deeply in relationships. Why? Because perfectionism creates emotional defensiveness. Criticism feels threatening. Mistakes feel shameful. Vulnerability feels dangerous. So they become highly self-protective, always trying to appear composed, capable, in control. But real connection requires imperfection. Real intimacy requires honesty, not performance. That's why many perfectionists secretly feel emotionally disconnected even while succeeding externally. Because nobody can fully connect with a person constantly hiding behind perfection. And eventually the mask becomes exhausting. Now let's talk about healing. How do you break perfectionism? First, stop treating mistakes like evidence of worthlessness. This is critical. A mistake is feedback, not identity. Read that again. A mistake is feedback, not identity. The moment you separate performance from self-worth, anxiety begins weakening. That's the transformation. Second, deliberately practice imperfection. This sounds uncomfortable because it is. Send a message without rewriting it 20 times. Post a work before it feels flawless. Speak honestly without rehearsing every sentence mentally first. Allow yourself to be human publicly sometimes. Your nervous system needs proof that imperfection is survivable. That's how fear loses authority. Third, stop attaching your identity to outcomes. This matters deeply. You are not your productivity. You are not your achievements. You are not your failures. And if your entire identity depends on external success, anxiety will control your life forever. Because outcomes are never fully controllable. That's reality. Strong people focus on effort, discipline, consistency, not emotional perfection. That's the key. Fourth, redefine success completely. Most perfectionists define success as flawlessness. Impossible. A healthier definition is this. Success means showing up honestly and consistently even when fear exists. That changes everything, because now mistakes no longer destroy your identity. They become part of growth itself. Fifth, learn to rest without guilt. This is huge. Perfectionists often believe rest must be earned. That belief destroys people slowly. You do not earn the right to breathe. You do not earn the right to recover. You do not earn the right to exist peacefully. Rest is not weakness. It is nervous system maintenance. That's discipline. And finally, understand this clearly. Nobody is thinking about your imperfections as much as you are. Most people are too busy fighting their own insecurities. That realization creates freedom. You can stop performing perfection constantly. You can stop trying to become emotionally untouchable. You can stop building impossible standards that no human being can sustain forever. Because peace does not come from becoming flawless. Peace comes from becoming real. That's the key. And the moment you stop trying to be perfect, something extraordinary begins happening. You breathe differently, move differently, think differently. Your nervous system softens. Your mind becomes quieter. Your relationships become more honest, because you are no longer living inside constant fear of making mistakes. That freedom changes people deeply, but escaping perfectionism is only part of the journey. Because even after people stop chasing flawlessness, many still feel trapped in another exhausting cycle. The endless performance of trying to maintain an image for the world. You are learning how fear disguises itself as perfection. Now, let's talk about what happens when you finally stop performing altogether. Learning to stop performing. Most people are not living anymore. They are performing. Performing competence. Performing happiness. Performing confidence. Performing success. Performing strength. And after years of doing this, they become exhausted without understanding why. Because performance consumes enormous energy. That's the key. Every time you hide your real emotions to maintain an image, your nervous system pays a price. Every time you pretend to be okay when you are not, your body notices. Every time you shape yourself into whatever version feels most acceptable, you move further away from yourself. And eventually the distance becomes unbearable. That is why so many people feel disconnected from their own lives. Not because they are weak, because they have spent years performing instead of existing honestly. Listen carefully. Image management is one of the most exhausting psychological jobs a human being can take on. Constantly calculating, constantly adjusting, constantly monitoring how people perceive you, trying to appear composed, trying to appear successful, trying to appear emotionally unaffected, trying to maintain control over everyone's impression of you. That creates anxiety automatically, because you cannot fully control perception. Ever. People will misunderstand you no matter how carefully you explain yourself. People will judge you no matter how carefully you behave. People will create stories about you that have nothing to do with reality. That's life. And the moment you finally accept that, something begins relaxing inside you, because you stop fighting an impossible war. You have a choice. Continue managing your image endlessly, or begin living honestly. That's the key. Now understand this clearly. Learning to stop performing does not mean becoming reckless. It does not mean oversharing everything. It does not mean becoming emotionally chaotic. It means becoming real. There's a difference. A real person allows themselves to be human, to have limits, to feel tired, to say no, to disappoint people sometimes, to stop pretending they can carry everything perfectly forever. That honesty creates freedom. But most people fear honesty because honesty risks rejection. If people see the real me, will they still stay? That fear controls millions of people silently. So they keep performing, keep smiling, keep overfunctioning, keep pretending they are stronger than they actually feel. And eventually they become emotionally numb, because performance disconnects people from themselves. That's the trap. The version of you that receives approval through performance is often not even the real you. So the validation never fully satisfies you. Why? Because deep down, your nervous system understands something painful. They love the performance, not necessarily me. That realization creates enormous loneliness. You can receive praise constantly and still feel emotionally unseen. Because being admired is not the same as being known. That's the key. Real connection requires honesty, not perfection, not performance. Honesty. And honesty begins when you stop needing everyone to see you as flawless. Think about how much energy people spend trying to appear emotionally untouchable, trying to look unaffected, trying to seem constantly productive, constantly calm, constantly successful. Why? Because vulnerability feels dangerous. But here is the truth. The people who truly love you do not require your exhaustion as proof. Read that again slowly. The people who truly love you do not require your exhaustion as proof. You do not have to destroy yourself to earn belonging. You do not have to overgive to deserve love. You do not have to constantly prove your value through sacrifice. That conditioning is breaking people psychologically. And many people do not realize how addicted they became to being needed. Because being needed creates identity. Being useful creates validation. Being dependable creates praise. But eventually people become terrified of slowing down because they no longer know who they are without performance. That is dangerous. Your identity cannot survive long-term if it depends entirely on productivity and usefulness. Sooner or later your nervous system collapses under that pressure. That's why boundaries matter. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protection. They protect your energy, your peace, your mental clarity, your emotional health. But people who spent years performing for approval often struggle deeply with boundaries. Why? Because boundaries disappoint people, and disappointing people triggers guilt. That reaction is normal. But guilt is not always a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional withdrawal symptom of breaking unhealthy conditioning. That's the key. You must stop interpreting temporary discomfort as evidence that boundaries are bad. Boundaries are honesty. And honesty creates healthier relationships than performance ever will. Now, let's talk about emotional honesty directly. Most people do not communicate honestly. They communicate strategically. They say what keeps peace, what avoids tension, what maintains approval. But eventually this creates resentment. Because suppressed truth always becomes emotional weight. Always. You cannot continuously silence yourself without consequences. The body remembers. The nervous system remembers. The exhaustion accumulates slowly. And one day people suddenly realize, I don't even know what I genuinely feel anymore. That happens when performance becomes identity. You lose connection with your authentic emotional experience. That is why slowing down matters. Silence matters. Solitude matters. Because when external performance finally stops, your real emotions become visible again. That process can feel uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort is honesty returning. Most people avoid silence because silence exposes what performance was hiding. Fear, sadness, loneliness, burnout, emptiness. But healing requires confrontation, not distraction. You cannot heal what you continuously avoid. That's discipline. Now understand this deeply. The goal is not to make everyone comfortable with your authenticity. Impossible. Some people benefited from your lack of boundaries. Some people benefited from your constant self-sacrifice. Some people preferred the version of you that never said no. When you stop performing, those people may become uncomfortable. Let them. That's the key. You are not responsible for making your healing convenient for everyone else. Strong people understand this. Disappointing others temporarily is sometimes necessary to stop abandoning yourself permanently. That realization changes lives. Now, let's get practical. How do you stop performing? First, stop pretending you are okay when you are exhausted. You do not need to dramatize your pain, but you do need honesty. Rest when needed. Speak truthfully. Acknowledge your limits. Your body is not a machine. Second, stop over-explaining your boundaries. This is huge. People addicted to approval often turn every boundary into a long, emotional presentation. Why? Because they fear judgment. But mature boundaries are calm, simple, clear. I can't do that. I need rest. That doesn't work for me. That is enough. You don't need their permission. Third, allow silence in conversations. People who perform constantly often panic during emotional silence. They rush to fix, explain, fill the gap. Why? Because silence feels unsafe. Practice remaining calm anyway. Not every emotional moment needs immediate management. That is nervous system discipline. Fourth, spend time completely disconnected from performance environments. No social media. No image management. No proving. No audience. Just you. That space matters. Because if you never leave performance mode, you will never rediscover who you are underneath it. And finally, ask yourself this question honestly. If nobody was watching, how would I actually want to live? That question exposes everything. Because many people are building lives designed for approval instead of peace. That is why they feel empty even after achieving things. They build a life for appearances, not alignment. And alignment matters more. That's the key. The moment you stop performing constantly, your nervous system begins relaxing in ways that are difficult to describe until you experience them. You breathe differently, think differently, sleep differently. Because for the first time in years, you are no longer carrying the impossible responsibility of managing everyone's perception of you. That freedom is powerful. And from that freedom, something deeper finally becomes possible. Real self-respect. Not the kind built on applause. The kind built quietly through honesty. But before someone can fully return to themselves, they must confront one final truth. The version of life they were chasing may never have actually belonged to them in the first place. You are learning how to stop performing for the world. Now, let's talk about returning to the person underneath the performance entirely. Returning to yourself. At some point, every exhausted person arrives at the same question. If I stop performing, if I stop proving, if I stop chasing approval, who am I underneath all of it? That question matters. Because many people have spent so many years adapting to expectations that they no longer recognize themselves clearly anymore. They know roles, responsibilities, obligations, but not themselves. That is the hidden cost of living in survival mode for too long. You become disconnected from your own inner life, disconnected from your own needs, your own desires, your own peace. And eventually your nervous system begins begging for something your mind keeps postponing. Rest. Real rest. Not distraction. Not temporary escape. Rest. That's the key. Most people are not physically exhausted first. They are emotionally overloaded, mentally overloaded, spiritually overloaded, because they spent years carrying invisible pressure inside their bodies. Pressure to achieve. Pressure to perform. Pressure to be enough, pressure to maintain an image, pressure to avoid disappointing people, pressure to keep moving no matter how empty they feel. And eventually something inside them breaks quietly, not dramatically, quietly. They stop feeling present in their own lives. Food loses flavor. Conversations feel distant. Mornings feel heavy. Joy feels muted. Not because they are lazy, not because they are weak, because their nervous systems were never designed to operate under endless pressure without recovery. That's reality. And healing begins the moment you stop treating yourself like a machine. You are not a machine. You are a human being. That means you require rest, stillness, silence, recovery, compassion, and most importantly, permission to exist without constantly earning your worth. Read this slowly. You do not have to earn rest. You do not have to earn peace. You do not have to earn your right to exist. That sentence alone can change a life. Because so many people unconsciously believe the opposite. They believe rest must be deserved. Peace must be earned. Slowing down must be justified. But that belief creates endless suffering. Why? because there will always be more to do. Another goal, another responsibility, another expectation, another pressure. If peace only arrives after perfection, peace never arrives. That's the trap. And most people stay trapped there for years, always postponing their own lives. I'll relax after this. I'll be happy when I achieve more. I'll rest when everything is finally under control. But everything never becomes fully controlled. Life keeps moving. That's why inner peace is not something you find at the end of achievement. It is something you practice during uncertainty. That's the key. And that practice begins with slowing down. Not quitting life, not abandoning responsibility, slowing down internally, breathing before reacting, pausing before panicking, resting before collapse, choosing presence instead of constant mental acceleration. Most people move through life too fast to hear themselves clearly. Too much noise, too much stimulation, too much comparison, too much pressure. Their minds are constantly occupied, but rarely peaceful. And eventually they lose connection with the present moment entirely. They live in regret about the past, or fear about the future. Almost never here, almost never now. But your life is happening now, not someday. Now, that realization changes people deeply, because presence heals the nervous system. When you slow down enough to notice your breathing, notice your body, notice the quiet moments, something begins softening inside you. The nervous system realizes, I am safe enough to stop running for a moment. That matters. Now understand something important. Returning to yourself does not happen all at once. It happens through small repeated choices. You choose rest instead of endless proving. You choose honesty instead of performance. You choose boundaries instead of self-abandonment. You choose peace instead of constant emotional chaos. You choose authenticity instead of approval addiction. Again and again, that repetition rebuilds identity. That's the key, because healing is not one massive breakthrough. It is nervous system retraining, slowly teaching yourself that life does not have to feel like an emergency anymore. And one of the biggest transformations happens when you redefine success entirely. Most people inherited definitions of success that were never truly theirs. More money, more status, more productivity, more achievement, more validation. But external success means very little if your inner world is collapsing. What is the value of achievement if you are constantly anxious? What is the value of admiration if you secretly hate your life? What is the value of being impressive if you cannot rest peacefully at night? Those questions matter, because many people are climbing ladders that lead nowhere meaningful for them personally. That's why slowing down matters. Slowing down creates clarity. It forces you to ask, what actually matters to me? Not to society, not to social media, not to people expecting things from you. To you. That answer is where real life begins. Maybe success is peace. Maybe success is emotional stability. Maybe success is waking up without dread. Maybe success is relationships where you can be honest. Maybe success is a nervous system that no longer feels constantly threatened. Maybe success is finally liking the person you become when nobody is watching. That's the transformation. And here's another truth most people avoid. Inner peace often requires grieving the person you thought you had to become. The endlessly productive version. The perfect version. The always available version. The constantly successful version. The version that never rested. Never slowed down. Never disappointed anyone. That version was survival, not freedom. You are allowed to let that version go. You do not need their permission. That's the key. Now listen carefully. Self-compassion is not weakness. It is emotional maturity. Many people speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to another human being. Constant criticism, constant pressure, constant judgment, and then they wonder why they feel exhausted. Your nervous system is always listening to the way you speak to yourself. Always. That voice matters. Discipline matters too. But true discipline is not self-hatred. It is self-respect. It is taking care of your mind, protecting your energy, Maintaining your peace. Building habits that support your nervous system instead of destroying it. That is real strength, not emotional punishment. That's the key. Now, let's talk about presence. Presence is powerful because it interrupts psychological suffering. Most suffering lives in mental time travel, regret, fear, catastrophizing, comparison. But presence brings the mind back to reality, to breathing, to this moment, to what is actually happening instead of what the mind imagines might happen. That practice changes the brain slowly. And slowly, the nervous system stops expecting catastrophe everywhere. You stop rushing constantly. Stop proving constantly. Stop performing constantly. And for the first time in years, your inner world begins feeling quieter, lighter, safer. Not because life became perfect, but because you finally stopped fighting yourself every moment of the day. That changes everything. And eventually you realize something profound. Peace was never hiding in achievement, never hiding in approval, never hiding in perfection. Peace was buried underneath the pressure you carried for years, underneath the fear, underneath the performance, underneath the exhaustion. And the moment you finally put that weight down, even briefly, you begin remembering who you were before the world taught you to constantly prove your worth. That is what returning to yourself really means. Not becoming someone new. Remembering who you were underneath the survival patterns all along. That is freedom. That is healing. That is peace. And now, for the first time, you are finally ready to stop surviving your life and start living it. Maybe the reason you feel so tired all the time isn't because life is impossible. Maybe it's because you've been carrying a version of yourself that was built entirely around survival. A version that learned very early that love had to be earned, that approval had to be secured, that mistakes were dangerous, that slowing down meant falling behind. But your life was never meant to be lived like a never-ending audition. You were not born to spend every waking moment proving your worth. And perhaps real peace begins the moment you stop asking, "Am I enough of the world?" and start asking, "What would life feel like if I believed I was already enough?" Not perfect, not superior, not endlessly productive, just enough. Enough to rest, enough to breathe, enough to exist without apology. The world will continue asking for more from you. More speed, more achievement, more perfection, more performance. But your soul has been asking for something entirely different. Stillness, presence, gentleness, and maybe tonight, for the first time in a very long time, you can finally stop fighting yourself long enough to hear it. Your peace was never waiting somewhere in the future. It was waiting beneath the pressure all along.